Hi there. We had a bit of rain recently, so the snow fort has a few more windows than it did before, as well as a much bigger door. I'm a little tired. I haven't gotten much sleep. Uh, Spent most of the day in the hospital. Gray's been in a lot of pain these past few days, and they've determined that he has an infection in his kidney and his bladder, possibly in his blood. So they were testing for that when I saw him a couple hours ago. So I was at the hospital with him all night, mostly being useless and in the way. Yeah, I haven't really slept yet. Now, going to a hospital can be extremely unpleasant for a number of reasons, and for trans people, going to a hospital in an unfamiliar place can be really daunting because you don't know what sort of care you're going to get, how people are going to respond, and you're in a very vulnerable position. A lot of trans people have had very negative experiences with medical professionals or have heard horror stories from other trans people, so there's very little reason to trust that you'll be safe in these spaces and that you'll get the care that you need. So I wanted to talk a little about what that's like and about my personal experiences with the medical system. Now, first of all, I've been very fortunate to have not required much in the way of medical assistance over the years, and I haven't had any experiences that were really horrible. Mostly because of my experience, or mostly because of my appearance, I'm able to get in and out without anyone being aware that I'm trans, without having to disclose that I'm trans. And even in the past, when doctors have assumed that I was male and then discovered that I was female, their first thought was always that I had a hormone imbalance and not that I was trans. I think that's largely because of the invisibility of trans men and female-assigned trans people. I expect that reaction would be less common today than 5 years ago or so, just because there have been more trans men in the media and there's been more visibility. And I expect that would also be less common for trans women or male-assigned trans people. And that sort of invisibility can be really alienating, but it can also provide a bit of safety in these situations. People who might be hostile towards trans folk would have no idea that they were talking to one. It just wouldn't occur to them. Occasionally, I've had awkward or uncomfortable moments, the occasional glare or double take at the gynecologist's office. Usually what happens is that a doctor or a nurse considers themselves to be open-minded and doesn't have a problem with my being trans, but they haven't necessarily thought through the ramifications of that, especially things like how their other clients might react to me. Doctors especially can be very invested in being the expert, being the authority, and it doesn't always occur to them to just admit that this is a new situation for them and that they could use some advice from the client, or that they may have made a mistake. I also had not a bad experience, but a really awkward experience at a walk-in clinic once. It was partly about being trans and partly about being autistic. I was having kind of a social anxiety panic attack because I was having to talk to a stranger about having a yeast infection. And I was finding it really hard to answer the doctor's questions in anything more than just yes or no. Even after I told her that I was trans, it took a really long time for her to understand that I just didn't have a penis, because she wasn't familiar with female-assigned trans people. And it took me a really long time to realize what she was trying to get at, because I was having a really autistic moment and answering only her question and no more. So she would ask, have you been circumcised? And I would just say no. And so it got to a point where we were just having a staring contest out with one another, trying to figure out what the other person was thinking, because we couldn't figure out what it was they were trying to say. And eventually she just said, penis or vagina? And I said, oh, vagina. So a yeast infection is one of the few occasions when a person's genitals are actually relevant to the conversation. Another thing that's kind of uncomfortable but funny is when I'm getting pap smears at my regular clinic, the staff there are all awesome and trans positive, but probably I would say 99% of their clients, when they're getting a pap smear, want to have a female nurse. And I have never been able to convince them that I feel more comfortable with a male nurse. And, you know, I don't know why. It's not that there's anything wrong with the other nurses. It's just, it's a sensitive situation, and I find it easier to relax if it's a guy. So I have gone out of my way to schedule an appointment with a male nurse, and they always assume that there's been a mistake, and they try to fix it, and then they switch it around so that I'm with a female nurse. When I have gotten a male nurse, they're always really apologetic and try to reassure me that I'm safe, and I just can't convince them that this is what I want. Now, psychiatric services have been a different matter. Provincial health insurance mostly doesn't cover psychiatric care, so that really limits what I can get. It would cost me several months' income to see an autism specialist, you know, and I need that money for rent and food, so that hasn't happened yet. And the last time I went to see a psychiatrist, it was for autism-related issues, and he kept on wanting to talk about my gender and my sexuality in a way that I found really invasive and not relevant to my visit. And it made me really anxious because I needed him to write a recommendation so that I could access a particular service for autism. And I felt like he was suspicious of me and not trusting the way I was representing myself because I was trans. I felt really uncomfortable being there, but he was the only doctor I could afford to go to who had the authority to write the recommendation. So, and that's been fairly typical of my experience with psychiatrists. Most of my experience with psychiatrists haven't been so good. Some friends of mine have had much, much worse experiences in accessing medical care, and it isn't always clear if it's directly because they are trans, or because they are autistic, or because they are poor, or because they're just unlucky. When I was with Gray in the hospital, he was in extreme pain, and he said it was worse than a few months ago when he had a crushed disc in his spine. He told the triage nurse that he was in severe pain, and he was still in severe pain 4 hours later when he saw the doctor, and he was still in severe pain 4 hours after that when the doctor went home without having prescribed anything for him for the pain. It just seemed like the doctor there and most of the staff weren't taking him seriously. That might have been in part because he's trans. Often trans people are viewed as liars or as crazy. There's a lot of associations with trans people and addictions because a lot of trans people do have addictions, and that becomes a stereotype which can make it difficult to access things like painkillers. It might have also had to do with the fact that he's autistic. Autistic people are also often accused of lying, even though we tend to be intensely truthful because we can be very literal and precise in our language, and that sounds unnatural to a lot of neurotypical people. Most people lie a little bit all the time. When somebody says, "No, this is the worst pain of my life," they're usually being hyperbolic. But when an autistic person says that, they generally mean it. We tend to mean exactly what we say, and people assume that we're exaggerating, or they assume that we're lying a little bit, because they're just not expecting that sort of literalness. Also, autistic people can have what's called a flat affect or no affect, especially when they're under stress. That's where your voice goes very flat and neutral, and you don't show the sort of signs that neurotypical people associate with urgency or with someone who's in severe pain. So, for whatever reason, Gray wasn't given painkillers and wasn't given very clear communication about what was happening. The doctor told him that he could have something for the pain, but a couple hours later, when we asked a nurse about it, she said that the doctor had gone home and that he hadn't prescribed anything, and that she couldn't give him any medication because she needed the doctor to okay that. Fortunately, one of the nurses was really great, Melanie. Thank you so much, Melanie. And so 12 hours after we arrived, she was able to arrange for him to get painkillers, and she also got him a room in the emergency ward, whereas before he'd been on a stretcher in the hallway. So I'm pretty mad that the doctor didn't listen when he said that he was in severe pain, and it's hard to say if either the transness or autism played a role in that, but now it looks like he is receiving good care. The nurses are friendly, especially Melanie and Haley. So far, no one has commented about the trans thing. Gray did overhear one doctor saying that it was a learning experience. So it's not perfect, but I'd say he's getting care as good or as better, or better than he usually gets in Toronto, where they're used to transgender clients. And when I think of some of the stories that I've heard from older trans folks, in some ways it amazes me how far things have come in healthcare for trans people. That we could get fairly decent service at the local hospital out here in the middle of nowhere. So I'll be visiting Gray again tomorrow, and I hope he comes home soon. That's all for now. Take care.